She was useful back then, but every company outgrows the people who helped it begin.
Your position in our arrangement will be over. Then your deal will be over too.
Power does not always reveal a person's true character. Sometimes it only gives them enough confidence to expose it. A man can spend 20 years pretending to be humble, pretending to be grateful, pretending that the woman beside him is his equal. But give that same man $1 billion and a room full of people who applaud everything he says, and the mask does not thicken. It disappears. What was hidden becomes visible. What was patient becomes cruel. And the people who believed they were loved discover, often in front of an audience, that they were only ever useful. Betrayal is most dangerous when it comes from someone who believes loyalty is weakness and silence means helplessness. That is the miscalculation that destroys empires. Not greed, not ambition, certainty. The certainty that the person who stayed quiet for 22 years has nothing left to say, nothing left to give, and nothing left to take away. This is the story of Grant Whitmore, a billionaire chief executive who humiliated and fired his own wife during the single most important week of his career, in front of the very board that would decide whether he became one of the richest men in America. Grant believed Eleanor Whitmore was a devoted spouse from his early years, useful once, decorative now, and no longer necessary in the glamorous world he had built without her. He had no idea that for 6 months, she had quietly protected the merger he was about to celebrate. He had no idea the deal existed at all because of decisions she had made and relationships she had repaired, in rooms he never entered and conversations he never knew took place. By the following morning, Grant would discover that the wife he dismissed held more power over his empire than anyone seated at that table understood, including Grant himself. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss one of our upcoming stories. Grant Whitmore built Whitmore Dynamics from a single warehouse in Ohio into a global logistics and energy conglomerate worth $11 billion. He liked to tell that story at every dinner, every keynote, every interview, because it made him sound like a man who had earned everything alone, a self-made titan who had simply outworked everyone around him. He rarely mentioned that the warehouse belonged to Eleanor's father, or that the first 3 years of payroll were covered by money from Eleanor's own savings, money she had inherited when her mother passed away far too young. He rarely mentioned that Eleanor had sat beside him at every early negotiation, taking notes, catching mistakes, softening his temper in rooms where his temper could have cost them everything. Contributions he later folded quietly into his own legend as instinct and grit. By the time Grant turned 50, the company had offices in 14 countries and a headquarters on the 60th floor of a glass tower in Manhattan that bore his name in letters taller than a man. He owned 3 homes, a private aircraft, and a wine collection insured for more than most people's homes were worth. Eleanor had a small office 2 floors below his, a title that sounded important and meant very little, and a reputation among the staff as the only executive who remembered their children's names, who noticed when someone looked tired, who never once raised her voice in 20 years, a trait Grant had once found remarkable in a young wife and now, in a woman he considered past her usefulness, found simply irrelevant. Their daughter, Claire, was 24, working as a junior attorney at a firm downtown, and watched her parents' marriage the way people watch weather they cannot control, aware something was shifting long before anyone said it aloud. She loved her father, admired the empire he had built, and had grown up believing the stories he told about building it alone. She adored her mother, though she sometimes wondered, quietly, why a woman as sharp as Eleanor had never asked for more than a small office and a title with no real department attached to it. She had also noticed, over the last year, that her father laughed differently around a woman named Camille Ford. A 32-year-old Vice President Grant had personally promoted 3 times in 18 months, each promotion announced with more enthusiasm than the last. Claire had said nothing. In families like the Whitmores, silence was inherited before anything else. The merger at the center of this story was not simple. Whitmore Dynamics was 3 weeks from finalizing a $9 billion acquisition of Callaway Industries, a shipping and infrastructure company controlled by a man named Nathaniel Callaway, whose family had built ports on 3 continents across 4 generations. If the deal closed, Grant would control one of the largest logistics networks on Earth, and his personal net worth would nearly triple overnight. Financial magazines had already begun drafting profiles calling him the next great American titan, comparing him to men whose names appeared on buildings and universities. Grant had started rehearsing his acceptance speech for an award he had not yet won, practicing certain phrases in the mirror of his private elevator on the ride up to the 60th floor each morning. What Grant did not know, and what almost no one in that boardroom knew, was that the merger had nearly collapsed twice in the past year, both times over the same reason. Nathaniel Callaway despised him, and had despised him for 14 years, long before either company had ever considered a formal partnership. 14 years earlier, at a private dinner meant to open early merger talks, Grant had mocked Nathaniel's father in front of a table of investors, calling the old man's shipping methods outdated, calling the family business a relic that desperately needed Grant's modern vision to survive another decade. Grant had laughed while saying it. Several investors had laughed along with him. Nathaniel's father had said nothing, finished his meal in silence, and died 2 years later without ever speaking to Grant Whitmore again. Nathaniel never forgot the humiliation his father absorbed that night, quietly, without complaint, the way proud men often absorb things they cannot fix. When Grant's team approached Callaway Industries again this year, hungry for the scale only Nathaniel's ports could provide, Nathaniel refused even to take the meeting. The deal that would define Grant's legacy was dead before it began, and Grant never knew it, because someone else had quietly resurrected it without ever asking for credit. That someone was Eleanor. 6 months earlier, Eleanor had reached out to Nathaniel Callaway privately, not as Grant's wife, but as the woman who had once written him a handwritten letter of apology on Grant's behalf. An apology Grant never knew she had sent. An apology that took Nathaniel 11 years to finally answer. Over a series of quiet dinners Grant never attended and never once asked about, dinners Eleanor scheduled around her own calendar without explanation, she rebuilt a relationship her husband had destroyed with a single arrogant sentence at a dinner table 14 years earlier. Nathaniel agreed to reopen merger talks on one condition, a condition he made clear only to Eleanor and never once mentioned to Grant directly. He wanted her present, in some real capacity, throughout the entire negotiation. He trusted her completely. He did not trust her husband at all, and told her so plainly, more than once, over wine neither of them finished. Eleanor never told Grant why the deal had suddenly become possible again after years of silence from the Callaway family. She let him believe his own charm, his own numbers, his own reputation had done it, because she had learned, over 22 years of marriage, that Grant's ego required feeding in order to function properly, the way an engine requires fuel it cannot manufacture on its own. She let him take the credit because she genuinely wanted the deal to succeed, not for him, but for the 4,000 employees whose jobs and mortgages and children's tuition depended on it, and for a company she had helped build with money that came from her own mother's death, money she had never once mentioned publicly in 20 years. She thought that quiet sacrifice was simply what marriage required of a person who loved deeply and asked for little. She was about to learn, in the span of a single Tuesday morning, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. The trouble began 19 days before the merger was scheduled to close, in a conference room on the 60th floor with glass walls overlooking the entire island of Manhattan. The kind of view that made ordinary people feel small and powerful people feel entitled. Grant had called an all-hands strategy session with the board, senior executives, outside counsel, and, unexpectedly, several members of the press invited specifically to witness what Grant called a preview of the new Whitmore Dynamics era, a phrase his communications team had workshopped for nearly a week. Eleanor had been added to the calendar invitation almost as an afterthought, the way she always was, listed simply as executive advisor, a title with no real department attached to it, and no clear reason for existing at all, at least to anyone who had not seen what she actually did. She arrived early, as she always did, carrying a folder of notes on the Calloway relationship that no one else in the building possessed. Not even Grant, who had signed documents for months without reading past the first page. She sat near the back, out of habit, not because she believed she belonged there, but because 30 years of being underestimated teaches a person exactly where the safest seat in any room tends to be. Grant walked in 12 minutes late, trailed by Camille Ford, who carried his coffee and his notes, and, increasingly, the confidence of someone who believed she had already replaced the person she was walking beside. Grant began the meeting by praising his own leadership, his own instincts, his own $11 billion vision, gesturing at slides that credited nobody else by name, and the room applauded the way rooms full of employed people always applaud a man who signs their checks, whether or not they believe every word. Then, without warning, and without any private conversation beforehand, without so much as a phone call the night before, Grant turned toward Eleanor and, in front of the board, the press, and every executive in the company, told her that her advisory role was being eliminated effective immediately, that the company was entering a new chapter that required, in his words, fresh energy and forward focus, and that he wanted to formally thank her for her past contributions before wishing her well in whatever came next. He did not use the word wife. He did not mention 22 years of marriage, 2 decades of shared holidays, a daughter raised in the space between his ambition and her patience. He referred to her, in front of cameras and strangers, the way a man refers to an employee whose contract has quietly and unremarkably expired. A few executives shifted in their seats. One reporter near the front lowered her pen, uncertain whether what she had just witnessed was newsworthy or simply cruel, unsure which category it belonged in. Camille Ford, standing just behind Grant's shoulder, allowed herself the smallest, briefest smile, the kind meant to be private, though Claire, had she been in the room, would have recognized it instantly for what it was. Eleanor did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply closed her folder, the one containing 6 months of private correspondence with Nathaniel Calloway, the one Grant had never once asked to read, and she said only that she understood, and that she hoped the merger would bring the company everything he believed it would. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her jacket, thanked the room for their time as though she were the one hosting it, and walked out through the glass doors while photographers who had come to document Grant's triumph instead captured, without realizing it, the quiet exit of the one person holding his triumph together. Grant felt nothing but relief as the doors closed behind her. He believed he had finally cleared away the last remnant of his old life to make room for the new one he had built, brick by brick, deal by deal, entirely, in his own mind, alone. He had no idea that within 24 hours, the foundation beneath the merger, the one thing keeping Nathaniel Calloway at the negotiating table at all, was about to disappear along with her. That evening, Grant took Camille to dinner at a restaurant on the 52nd floor of a building he partially owned, and told her, over wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent, that Eleanor's dismissal was long overdue. that Eleanor had never truly understood the scale of what he had built, and that the company finally reflected who he really was: unencumbered, modern, exactly the vision he had always carried in his head. Camille smiled and said all the right things, because Camille had learned in her 3 rapid promotions exactly what Grant wanted to hear and exactly how much that particular skill was worth in a company like his. What Grant did not know, sitting in that restaurant with the entire city glittering beneath him, was that his phone, resting silent on the table beside his wine glass, would not stop ringing by morning. Eleanor went home that night to a house Grant rarely visited anymore, poured herself a glass of water instead of wine, and sat alone at the kitchen island where she had once helped him draft the company's very first supplier contracts by hand, back when neither of them owned a suit that fit properly. She called Claire, not to complain, but because she did not want her daughter to hear about the boardroom from anyone else first. Claire listened in silence, then asked her mother, quietly, whether she was going to fight it. Eleanor told her she did not yet know what fighting even meant in a situation like this one, and that she needed a night to simply sit with what had happened before deciding anything at all. Claire offered to come over. Eleanor told her she would be fine, though neither of them fully believed it. Nathaniel Calloway learned of Eleanor's dismissal, not from Grant, who never thought to inform him, but from a junior associate who had been present in the room and mentioned it casually during an unrelated call about shipping logistics. Nathaniel listened, asked the associate to repeat exactly what she had said, word for word, and then sat in silence for nearly a full minute before asking to be connected to his legal team immediately. Eleanor had not asked him to intervene. She had not called him, texted him, or sent a single message since walking out of that conference room. She wanted, if anything, to handle whatever came next with the same quiet dignity she had carried for 2 decades, without asking anyone to fight her battles for her. But Nathaniel Calloway did not need her to ask. He remembered every dinner, every letter, every quiet act of repair Eleanor had made on behalf of a marriage and a man who clearly did not deserve either. And he remembered, with total clarity, the single condition he had given her legal team 6 months earlier, the condition that had made the entire negotiation possible in the first place: that Eleanor Whitmore remain involved throughout the entirety of the dealings between their 2 families, in whatever capacity she chose, for as long as the agreement remained open. At 9 the next morning, Nathaniel's legal counsel sent formal notice to Whitmore Dynamics that Callaway Industries was pausing all merger proceedings, effective immediately, pending, in the letter's exact language, a review of recent leadership changes and their impact on the terms both parties had privately agreed to honor months earlier. Grant read the letter twice before he fully understood what it meant. His hands, for the first time in years, were not steady as he set the paper down on his desk. He called an emergency session with his general counsel, a sharp, exhausted woman named Renata Osei, who had warned him 3 separate times over the past year that the Callaway relationship was more fragile than his ego allowed him to see. Renata explained, as calmly as she could manage, that Callaway's legal team had cited a personal guarantee clause buried deep in the preliminary agreement, one that Grant had signed without fully reading, because Eleanor had assured him at the time it was standard language. It was not standard. It was specific. It tied continued negotiation, in writing, to Eleanor Whitmore's ongoing involvement in the deal. Grant asked, his voice rising sharply, why no one had told him this before, why he was only learning of it now, 3 weeks from closing the largest deal of his career. Renata answered quietly that Eleanor had told him, in a detailed memo he had forwarded to his assistant without reading past the first paragraph, 11 months earlier, a memo his own assistant could produce with a timestamp if he wanted proof. Grant sat alone in his office that night, the city glowing beneath him the way it always did, though for the first time it felt less like a view he owned and more like a view watching him. The deal that was supposed to make him one of the richest men in America now hung by a single clause he had never bothered to understand, tied entirely to a woman he had publicly discarded less than 24 hours earlier. For the first time since he founded the company, Grant Whitmore did not know what to do next, and the not knowing frightened him more than any market downturn ever had. He called Eleanor at 11 that night. She let it ring 4 times before answering, not out of cruelty, but because for the first time in years, she was allowing herself the small dignity of not rushing to fix his problems the moment his voice appeared on her screen. When she finally picked up, Grant did not apologize. He asked her to come in the next morning and speak with Nathaniel personally, to smooth things over, framing it as a professional courtesy she owed the company after everything it had given her over the years. Eleanor listened without interrupting, and then asked him a single question. Did he understand why Nathaniel had agreed to the merger in the first place? Grant said, honestly, that he assumed it was the numbers, the scale, the opportunity too large for any businessman to refuse. Eleanor said nothing further, told him she would consider his request, and ended the call. She did not sleep that night, not because she was afraid of losing anything, but because for the first time in 22 years, she was beginning to understand exactly what she was actually holding, and exactly how long she had been holding it, without anyone, including herself, fully acknowledging its weight. The following morning, Grant arrived at the office before dawn, something he had not done since the company's earliest years in that Ohio warehouse, and found Renata already waiting outside his door with a folder she said Eleanor had personally delivered to legal that morning, requesting it be forwarded to him directly and without delay. Grant opened it expecting an apology, or perhaps a private message asking him to reconsider his decision from the day before. Instead, he found copies of 9 years of founding documents, stock allocation records, and a single handwritten letter, dated 14 years earlier, addressed to Nathaniel Calloway, that Eleanor had written and signed entirely on her own, without his knowledge or approval. The letter was an apology, written in Eleanor's own careful words, for the arrogance Grant had shown Nathaniel's father at that long-ago dinner, an arrogance Grant himself had likely forgotten by the following morning. It was warm, specific, and completely unauthorized by Grant, who had never known it existed until this exact moment, sitting alone in an office he had once believed he controlled completely. Attached to it was Nathaniel's original reply, sent 11 years later, agreeing to reopen a relationship he had sworn he never would, on the sole condition that Eleanor, and only Eleanor, remain part of any future dealings between their two families. Grant read the letter 3 times, his understanding of the past 6 months rearranging itself with every sentence, the ground beneath his own legend shifting slightly with each line. He had believed his own charisma had revived a dead relationship, had told that story to reporters, to Camille, to himself in quiet, private moments. In truth, his wife had spent over a decade quietly repairing a wound he never knew he had caused, and doing it without a single word of credit, without a single request in return, without ever once mentioning it to the man whose reputation she had spent years protecting. He called Eleanor immediately, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed. She did not answer. He called again an hour later. Still nothing. It was not until nearly noon that Renata walked into his office again, this time visibly pale, holding a second document that had just been formally filed with the company's legal department, a document Grant had never seen before, though his own signature appeared, unmistakably, on the very first page of it. It was the original founding equity agreement of Whitmore Dynamics, drafted 20 years earlier during the company's second year, when a supplier lawsuit had nearly bankrupted the entire operation before it ever left that Ohio warehouse. Grant remembered that period only vaguely, remembered it as a difficult stretch he had powered through on instinct and grit and sheer stubbornness. What he had conveniently forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood at the time, distracted as he was by the daily fight for survival, was exactly where the money came from that kept the company alive during those 4 brutal months. Eleanor's mother had passed away the year before, leaving her a modest inheritance, just under $2 million, money Eleanor had placed directly into the company in exchange for a formal equity stake, drafted quickly by a lawyer neither of them could really afford at the time. Grant had signed the agreement in a rush, distracted, grateful, promising Eleanor over a rushed dinner that they would formalize a buyout once the company stabilized properly. They never did. Not because Eleanor forgot, and not because she was careless with paperwork, because she chose, quietly, year after year, deal after deal, not to bring it up, believing love meant not needing to keep score of every sacrifice made along the way. Made along the way. Grant remembered fragments of those 4 months if he let himself sit with them long enough. Fragments he had spent 20 years choosing not to revisit. He remembered a supplier threatening legal action over a shipment gone wrong, a lawsuit that could have ended the company before it ever completed a single successful order. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning with Eleanor, both of them doing math on a legal pad because they could not afford an accountant, both of them terrified in a way neither ever admitted to the other at the time, not even years later. He remembered Eleanor leaving the room one evening and returning with a folder from her mother's estate, quiet and steady, telling him simply that she wanted to help, that she believed in what they were building together, and that she wanted it in writing, not because she doubted him, but because her own mother had taught her that love and good business were not opposites, and that a woman should never hand over everything she had without something in return, even to a man she trusted completely with her future. Grant had agreed instantly, desperate and grateful, and had genuinely meant at the time to make good on a formal buyout the moment the company found stable ground beneath it. He simply never did, and over 20 years of growth and success, he slowly stopped remembering that he had ever needed to at all. The agreement had never been amended, never dissolved, never bought out, never even discussed again after that first difficult year. For 20 years, Eleanor Whitmore had held 18% equity in the very company her husband now stood in front of cameras, claiming to have built entirely alone, entirely through his own force of will. Grant stared at the number until it stopped making sense to him. 18% of an $11 billion company was not a symbolic gesture, not a sentimental leftover from an earlier era. It was not the kind of stake a company simply eliminates with a sentence about fresh energy and forward focus, delivered in front of cameras. It was real, it was legally binding, and it meant that the man who had fired his wife 24 hours earlier did not have the unilateral authority to do so in the first place, not without triggering a shareholder review that could unravel every board decision made in the past 2 decades of the company's existence. Grant sat in stunned silence, the city outside his window suddenly feeling much smaller than it had the day before, the letters of his own name on the building somehow less impressive than they had felt just 3 days earlier. Word moves quickly inside a company that size, and by early afternoon, whispers had reached the board members who had applauded Grant's speech only 2 days before. 2 of them, quietly and separately, requested emergency calls with legal counsel of their own, unwilling to be caught unprepared if the story became public. A third, a longtime director named Harold Voss, who had known Eleanor since the company's earliest years, who remembered her taking notes at kitchen tables long before either of them owned a proper office chair, who had personally witnessed her talk a panicked supplier off the edge of a lawsuit in the company's second year, using nothing but patience and a legal pad, called her directly, not the office line, her personal phone, and asked her, gently, what she intended to do with what she now knew. Beyond any doubt, she actually held. Eleanor's answer surprised even herself when she heard it out loud. She told Harold she had no interest in revenge, no interest in humiliating Grant the way he had humiliated her in front of cameras, and no interest in destroying a company that employed 4,000 families who had nothing whatsoever to do with her marriage. She said she only wanted the truth acknowledged, formally, in the same rooms where the lie had been allowed to grow, unchallenged, for 20 years. Harold, quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, told her that acknowledgement was about to become unavoidable, whether she asked for it or not, because Nathaniel Callaway had made it clear to the board that very morning that Callaway Industries would not proceed with any merger unless Eleanor Whitmore was formally reinstated, with real authority attached to her name, not a symbolic title, and unless the company issued a public correction of the record regarding her actual role in its 20-year history. Grant, when told of Nathaniel's terms by Renata later that afternoon, felt something close to panic for the first time in his adult life, a feeling he did not have language for because he had never needed it before. He asked whether there was any way to challenge the equity claim, any legal maneuver available to minimize its weight before the board meeting scheduled in 4 days. Renata, more directly than she had ever spoken to him in 9 years of working together, told him that challenging his own wife's 20-year-old signed agreement, in the middle of a merger already hanging by a single clause tied to her personal involvement, would not save the deal. It would end it, publicly and permanently, and likely end his position as chief executive along with it, within the same news cycle. Grant spent that night alone in his office again, staring at a city he had once believed belonged to him completely, beginning to understand, slowly and painfully, that the empire he thought he had built through sheer force of will had, in fact, been quietly held together for 2 decades by the very person he had discarded in front of cameras less than 48 hours earlier, a debt he had never once acknowledged even to himself. Camille noticed the shift in him before Grant said a single word about it out loud. She had built her rapid rise on reading rooms accurately, on sensing which way power was leaning before anyone announced it, and the room around Grant Whitmore had changed overnight, almost overnight, in a way she could feel even if she could not immediately name it. The confidence that once filled every space he entered had thinned into something brittle, something that flinched slightly at unexpected phone calls. When she asked him directly, over a quiet dinner he barely touched, what was happening with the merger, Grant, uncharacteristically, told her the truth, all of it. The letter, the equity, Nathaniel's condition, the board meeting looming 4 days away. He expected comfort in return, the way he always had. What he received instead was silence, and then a carefully worded question about what would happen to her own position if the board decided to reverse recent leadership changes as part of any correction. Grant heard, for the first time in 18 months, exactly what Camille had always been listening for, and the sound of it landed harder than anything Nathaniel's lawyers had sent him that week. 3 days before the scheduled board meeting, Eleanor received a call from Nathaniel Callaway directly, the first time in 14 years he had ever phoned her rather than the reverse. He told her plainly, without any preamble, that he had no intention of closing a deal with a company whose leadership treated loyalty as something disposable, and that his continued participation depended entirely on what role, if any, Eleanor chose to take moving forward, not because the board demanded it of him, but because he personally would not sign a single document unless her name was formally and permanently attached to the outcome. Eleanor asked him, quietly, why it mattered so much to him after all these years. Nathaniel answered simply that his own father had died, believing no one outside the family would ever treat their business with genuine respect, and that Eleanor, a stranger by blood, a woman with no obligation to his family at all, had proven him wrong with a single handwritten letter 14 years earlier. A kindness his own son, the very man now discarding her in front of cameras, had never once managed to offer him directly in 14 years of dealings. That conversation stayed with Eleanor longer than anything Grant had said to her in the 2 days since the boardroom, longer even than the memo she had once written and he had never read. It was not vindication she felt listening to Nathaniel's voice. It was something closer to clarity, the sudden, settling understanding that she had spent 2 decades building quiet trust in rooms Grant never entered, and that this trust, unlike his charisma, had not evaporated the moment it was actually tested by fire. News of the pause in merger talks reached financial reporters within 2 days, though the reason behind it remained unclear to the public. Speculation filled business columns and morning shows, most of it wrong, some of it uncomfortably close to the truth. One columnist, working from an anonymous tip inside the building, wrote a short paragraph asking why a company on the verge of historic growth had quietly removed its longest-serving advisor the same week the deal stalled. A question Grant's communications team spent an entire weekend trying to bury under unrelated press releases about unrelated product launches. That same columnist would return to the story months later, once the correction had been made public, and write a much longer piece, one that finally connected the dismissal, the pause in merger talks, and the sudden reinstatement into a single narrative. She interviewed former employees who described Eleanor exactly the way Harold Voss had, as the quiet center of a company that liked to credit its loudest voice instead. The piece did not accuse Grant of anything illegal. It did something he found, in its own way, far worse. It simply told the truth, plainly, and let readers draw their own conclusions about which Whitmore had actually built the empire everyone assumed belonged to one man alone. The board meeting convened on a Friday morning, 4 days after Grant's public dismissal of his wife, in the same glass conference room where the humiliation had taken place. This time, there was no press invited, no rehearsed acceptance speech, no applause waiting at the end of Grant's opening remarks. 14 board members sat in near silence as Renata Osei laid out, in careful legal language, the equity agreement, Nathaniel Calloway's conditions, and the very real risk that continuing without formally addressing both would collapse a merger the market had already begun pricing into the company's stock, a risk measured now in the billions rather than the millions. Grant sat at the head of the table, a position that suddenly felt less like authority and more like exposure, every eye in the room measuring him differently than it had 4 days earlier. He had prepared a statement overnight, reworking it 4 separate times, each version shorter and less defensive than the one before it, until what remained was something close to an admission, rather than an excuse. Words he had never practiced saying out loud before that morning. Before Grant could speak, Harold Voss asked whether Eleanor Whitmore was present in the building. She was. She had been asked to wait in a smaller conference room down the hall, not out of disrespect, but because no one, including Eleanor herself, had been certain until that morning whether she wished to walk back into that particular room at all, given everything it had cost her 4 days earlier. She chose to walk in. Eleanor entered wearing the same composed expression she had worn 4 days earlier when she was dismissed in front of cameras, but something in the room had shifted entirely around her in a way that had nothing to do with her own posture and everything to do with everyone else's. Executives who had barely acknowledged her presence for years now stood as she entered the room. Harold pulled out a chair, not the one near the back she always chose out of habit, but one directly across from Grant, at the very center of the table, and waited for her to sit before anyone else resumed their seat. Grant looked at his wife across a table he had built, in a building bearing his own name in letters taller than either of them, and understood, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that the woman across from him was not asking for permission to matter. She already did, and had for 20 years, whether he had ever noticed or not. Nathaniel Calloway had insisted on joining by video for this portion of the meeting, and when the call connected, his face filling the screen at the head of the room, he did not address Grant at all, not even a greeting. He spoke directly to Eleanor, thanking her for 14 years of patience with a family that had every reason to walk away from Whitmore dynamics entirely, and confirming, in front of the full board, that Calloway Industries would proceed with the merger only under two conditions. Eleanor Whitmore's formal reinstatement with genuine operational authority, not a ceremonial title designed to quiet a lawsuit, and public correction of the historical record regarding her actual role in the company's survival and success. The room turned to Grant, waiting for the objection everyone assumed was coming, the way it always had in every meeting for the past 20 years. It never arrived. Whatever pride Grant had built his entire identity around had, over 4 sleepless nights, quietly given way to something closer to fear. The plain recognition that the empire could genuinely end within the hour if he chose ego over survival one more time, in front of the one audience whose applause he could no longer buy. He agreed to both conditions without argument, his voice quieter than anyone in that room had heard it in years. It was, several board members later admitted privately, the first time they had seen Grant Whitmore make a decision without first considering how it would sound in a magazine profile 6 months from now. What followed was not a dramatic reversal delivered with triumphant music, the kind Grant might have staged for cameras a week earlier if the story had gone differently. It was quieter than that, and more permanent. Within 2 weeks, the merger closed, $9 billion in value, formally joining Whitmore Dynamics and Calloway Industries into a single entity, one that analysts began calling among the most significant infrastructure consolidations in a decade. A headline Grant had wanted for years and finally received under circumstances he never could have predicted. Grant's personal wealth did, in fact, increase substantially, exactly as he had always dreamed it would since that first difficult year in the Ohio warehouse. But the man who stood at the closing ceremony was not the same man who had rehearsed his acceptance speech 3 weeks earlier in the mirror of his private elevator. Eleanor stood beside him at that ceremony, not as a wife trailing behind her husband's triumph, but as newly and formally appointed vice chair of the combined company, a title the board had voted for unanimously, and one Nathaniel Calloway had insisted upon publicly, in front of the same reporters who had once documented her quiet exit from that glass conference room without understanding what they were actually watching. Camille Ford resigned from Whitmore Dynamics 11 days after the merger closed, taking a position at a smaller firm across the city. She told colleagues it was an opportunity too good to pass up, a step she had been considering for months. Most people close to the situation understood it rather differently. The moment Grant's position had genuinely wavered, the moment his confidence had thinned into something uncertain and untested, Camille had recognized, with the same accuracy that built her rapid rise in the first place, that she had attached herself to power rather than to a person, and that the power itself had briefly gone unstable in a way she had never planned for. She left before she had to find out whether it would fully recover, and before anyone had to ask her to. In her final week, a junior colleague asked Camille, half in jest, whether she regretted anything about the past 18 months. Camille answered honestly, in a rare unguarded moment, that she did not regret the ambition itself, only the miscalculation underneath it, the assumption that a man's confidence and his actual strength were the same quality, wearing the same expensive suit. It was a lesson, she admitted, she wished someone had taught her earlier in her career, before she staked her own reputation on borrowed certainty that evaporated the moment it was tested. Grant never spoke publicly about the affair, and Eleanor never asked him to, choosing instead to let certain truths remain private, even as others were forced into daylight. She had learned, in the 4 days between the boardroom and the merger closing, that some truths did not require public confrontation to be fully understood by the people who mattered. Claire, their daughter, learned of it eventually, not from her mother, who never once mentioned it, but from an executive assistant who assumed, incorrectly, that everyone in the building already knew. Claire confronted her father directly, the only member of the family willing to say aloud what everyone else had chosen to carry quietly between them. Grant did not defend himself. For the first time Claire could remember in 24 years, her father simply admitted he had been wrong about Camille, about the boardroom, about 22 years of assuming his wife's quiet strength meant she required nothing at all in return for it. The months that followed were not a fairy tale reconciliation, and this story does not pretend otherwise, because real life rarely offers such clean endings. Eleanor did not simply forgive Grant because his empire had been saved by her own quiet work. She spent those months deciding, carefully and without pressure from anyone, including her daughter, what kind of marriage, if any, she still wanted, now that she finally understood the full weight of what she had spent 2 decades quietly holding up without acknowledgement. Grant, for perhaps the first time since founding the company in that Ohio warehouse, spent those same months learning to ask questions instead of assuming answers, learning to sit in rooms without needing to be its loudest voice, learning that respect, once spent carelessly in front of cameras, does not return simply because circumstances forced an apology out of him. There were nights Eleanor genuinely considered leaving entirely, taking her formal role at the company and nothing else, closing the door on a marriage that had asked too much silence of her for too many years without ever asking what she needed in return. There were nights Grant genuinely believed, lying awake in a house that suddenly felt too large, that she would. What kept them in the same house, in the end, was not a grand romantic gesture, staged for anyone watching, but something smaller and far more honest. Grant showing up, repeatedly, in ordinary moments no camera would ever capture, learning her actual opinions on decisions he once made unilaterally, without a second thought, crediting her publicly and privately for contributions he had spent 20 years quietly absorbing as entirely his own. On that quiet Sunday, Claire asked her mother the question she had been carrying since the executive assistant first told her about Camille, the question she had never quite found the courage to ask directly until now. She asked whether Eleanor had known about the affair before the boardroom, before the humiliation, before any of it became public inside the company. Eleanor did not look away. She told her daughter honestly that she had suspected for close to a year, had noticed the small shifts in Grant's attention long before Camille's third promotion, and had chosen, deliberately, not to confront him about it while the Calloway relationship remained so fragile. Not out of fear, but because she refused to let her own personal pain become the reason 4,000 families lost their jobs. Claire sat with that answer for a long moment, then asked her mother whether it had been worth it, carrying that weight alone for so long without saying a word to anyone, not even her own daughter. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, the way she considered most things, and told Claire that she was no longer certain silence had ever been the right choice, only that it had been the choice available to her at the time, made by a woman who believed, wrongly, that dignity and invisibility were the same thing. She told Claire she hoped her daughter would never have to make that particular choice herself, and that if she ever did, she hoped she would choose differently, sooner, and without waiting 20 years for someone else to finally notice what she had built. Eleanor did not need vengeance to feel whole again, and she said so plainly, once, to Claire, over coffee on a quiet Sunday, months after the merger had closed. She had already lived, for 2 decades, as a woman whose value was treated as conditional, useful in private and invisible in public, useful when convenient and dismissed the moment it was not. The correction she ultimately received was not Grant's ruin, though ruin had certainly been within reach during those 4 difficult days. It was simply the truth finally being spoken aloud, in the same rooms where the lie had once been allowed to stand entirely unchallenged for 20 years. That, in the end, was the justice she actually wanted. Not his downfall, not his humiliation returned in kind, but her own name spoken with the weight it had always deserved and had rarely, if ever, received. A year after the merger closed, Whitmore Dynamics and Callaway Industries had grown into one of the most respected infrastructure companies in the country, and Eleanor Whitmore had become, by every internal account, one of the most trusted leaders inside it, known not for loud declarations or rehearsed keynote speeches, but for the same quiet reliability that had built the company from its very first difficult year in that Ohio warehouse. Nathaniel Callaway remained close with her long after the merger's legal work concluded, occasionally telling colleagues over dinner that the entire deal had only ever existed because one woman had chosen, over and over again for 14 years, to repair what a careless man had broken with a single arrogant sentence. Grant Whitmore still ran the combined company, still gave interviews, still stood for photographs beneath the letters of his own name stretched across the top of a glass tower 60 floors above the city. But something in those photographs had changed. Something people close to him noticed, even if strangers reading the magazine profiles at home did not. He no longer told the story of building an empire entirely alone, the story he had told for 20 years without correction. He told instead a longer and more complicated story about a woman whose worth he had once badly and repeatedly misjudged, and about learning, far too late for real comfort but not too late to matter, that the people who never demand credit are very often the ones actually holding everything together. Perhaps that is the real lesson underneath every story about power, wealth, and betrayal, the lesson worth sitting with long after the credits roll. Confidence does not measure character. It only measures how loudly a person is willing to reveal it once given enough room to do so without consequence. The men who fill rooms with their own certainty are rarely the ones actually holding those rooms up from underneath. More often, it is the quiet ones, overlooked, underestimated, and mistaken for weakness by people too loud to notice otherwise, who are keeping the entire structure from collapsing, all while asking for nothing in return except, eventually, simply to be seen for what they have always been. Grant Whitmore learned that lesson the hardest possible way. In front of cameras, in front of a board, in front of the one person who had spent 22 years believing loyalty and love meant the same quiet thing. He was fortunate, in the end, that the woman he humiliated wanted truth rather than ruin, correction rather than collapse. Not every man discovers that particular mercy in time, and fewer still deserve it when it arrives. And somewhere in a glass office on the 60th floor, past the letters spelling out his own name, Grant Whitmore now keeps a single framed document mounted on the wall behind his desk. Not a photograph of himself, not an award, not a magazine cover, but a copy of a 20-year-old equity agreement. A quiet reminder, every single day he sits down at that desk, of exactly whose strength his empire was truly built upon from the very beginning. Visitors to that office sometimes ask about the frame, expecting a story about some clever early investment or a lucky break in the company's history. Grant tells them the truth now, plainly, without the version of himself that once needed every story to end with his own genius at the center of it. He tells them it is a reminder that the loudest person in any room is rarely the one holding it together, and that the people who ask for nothing are usually the ones who deserve the most. It is not the story he once imagined telling about his own success. It is, in the end, a far better one, because unlike the version he spent 20 years perfecting for magazine covers and boardrooms full of applause, this one happens to be true.